Welcome to Economics and Beyond. I'm Rob Johnson, president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with John Powell, a professor and the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at University of California, Berkeley, a longtime friend from Detroit, and a very important member of the Institute for New Economic Thinking's Governing Board. John, thanks for joining me today.
Rob, it's a pleasure. I always enjoy talking to you.
And I with you. So we're in a place where this pandemic has unmasked an awful lot of things. We don't even know or have not assimilated all of the implications. But John, what is it that you've seen? What is it that you think is missing? What concerns you? What would you applaud in what's unfolding?
As everyone knows, since this actually touches really everyone, that in of itself is almost unprecedented. Uh, Even in terms of oftentimes war, there are pockets where things are relatively peaceful. But this pandemic actually affects the whole world. We have, at this point, over half the world in some kind of lockdown mode, which is also unprecedented. We have every state declaring a national or disaster or state disaster. That's unprecedented. Um, and the thing that's also interesting, Rob, is that unlike most disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, they happen, they're destructive, they take lives, they disrupt businesses, but then they're over. And also, oftentimes they happen in a particular place, Puerto Rico, India, uh, South Korea. And then if we are on our game, the whole world steps up to try to help. But this is the whole world being affected. So there's no safe place, and other places that are feeling the brunt of this. It's not even, they're hot spots, and that's part of the thing we need to actually deal with. So the hot spots, meaning there are certain localities, Detroit, Seattle, um, New York, New Jersey, uh, and many others, New Orleans, where we see a real flare up. And appropriately, we say we need to focus on those hotspots. But there are also hot communities or hot neighborhoods. And so it's not just Detroit, is that blacks in Detroit are being affected at a much, much higher rate. I just found out my niece, who's a nurse in Detroit, has COVID 19 and is at home with pneumonia. So the family is very worried. Um, and my sister, when she wrote me last night, said they've been trying to get protective covers. They've been trying to get equipment. They've been trying to get face masks. Um, so the unevenness of that, so all of the things that Detroit was already on the short end of, is amplified. Uh, there are very few testing centers in the city of Detroit. So if you think about the hot spots, we said we need to move resources there. But we need to think about it not just in terms of spots, but also in terms of different demographics. So why are blacks more likely to die, twice as likely to die in California from COVID than whites? Um, and some people have a almost blame the victim. It's like, well, if black people didn't smoke, if they didn't eat meat, if they didn't do it, and as you know, Rob, I'm a vegetarian. I don't smoke, but this pandemic is more than about personal behavior, and the unevenness of it is more than about personal behavior. The fact that blacks in Detroit have a hard time getting ventilators has nothing to do with whether they smoke or not. The fact that my niece cannot get a face mask and she's working in hospitals has nothing to do with um, uh, her diet or how much she exercises. And I just read today that even in terms of stimulus money, especially the payroll protection, disproportionately going to red states. And so what's happening now is like everyone knows something should be done, but will it be done in a way that's really fair, that's inclusive? Will it be done in a way that actually brings us together while recognizing that we're not all situated the same? Or will it be competition? Will it be a fight over scarcity? So to give you two last examples, one, the governor of California, Governor Newsom, he sent ventilators to New York. Well, some people was like, "What are you doing? California is in this crisis." And Newsom's response was, "We are not in a crisis in the way New York is. Maybe we're 2 weeks out, maybe we're 3 weeks out, maybe that won't happen to California. So we may need these ventilators here in California in the future. They need them right now." And so to me, that was an example of we're in this together. We're going to support each other. We're going to take risks together. Um, and but the other extreme is states bidding against each other for resources. So what the federal government is saying, we're out of it. You guys figure it out. We don't know what stuff is. Or even when states get some of those resources, the federal government divert them without telling them why, without having people be on board. So in large measures, we can say things will change. We probably never go back to what we were before the pandemic. But will they be better? Will we be more xenophobic? Will we be more nationalistic? Will we be more petty? Will we actually think we have to just protect our own? Or will we see that everyone is connected? We can't leave out anyone. Healthcare providers have said you can't leave out 12 million undocumented immigrants and address this pandemic. Growers are saying we can't keep our food supply going if we don't protect the workers who are disproportionately Latino and a lot of them undocumented. So it gives us a chance to either say we're really in this together and we need to structure that and respect that and tell stories about that, or is this a time to actually blame the other? Is this a time to say it's someone else's fault, whether it's the World Health Organization or whether it's blacks or Chinese or whites? So that's the big issue before us, that the pandemic is shining in our face.
And what what kind of responses do you see around the world, and where do you see? You mentioned hot spots in cities within the United States, but there are very, very, which you might call different institutional structures. You have a place like Europe where they don't even have a common fiscal policy. They have a common monetary policy and so forth in the EU, but transfers between governments is something that has to be negotiated. It's not something that's, which you might call at the core of social process. You have places like India where the need for fiscal capacity to finance things is so underdeveloped. And in other words, the basic infrastructure that produces health and life was not there at the starting gate. And so how can they mobilize the resources, or will the, which you might call, propagation of the pandemic and the severity of it migrate to places like southern India and the continent of Africa? How do you see the global portrait of what's unfolding?
Well, we've known, and the UN has been saying for years about the unevenness at a global level and unevenness along multiple axes. So you mentioned India, you think of Afghanistan, a lot of workers from Iran, in Iran were from Afghanistan and they're going back to Afghanistan. They have an even weaker infrastructure. But it's also interesting how we have people migrating all over the world. Uh, that's the good news and bad news. We are deeply, deeply interconnected. And sometimes, as James Baldwin says, uh, some people find that unfair, but none of us can do anything about it. Although some people are trying to do something about it. They think, well, build walls, shut down immigration, shut down migration, uh, hunker down. So in the short term, I think countries. I mean, it's too bad that we should be lifting up, even though they're not perfect, our international bodies to make sure that there's a floor, that we actually address this pandemic as a pandemic. Pandemic meaning it's global. It's affecting every country and people all over the world. So our response needs to be consistent with that. And so it's not enough to say, I mean, to some extent we did this. This is a Chinese problem in December and January, so we don't need to worry about it. Instead of how do we actually worry together? This is a virus. There was already early indication it was not going to stay put. What could we learn starting in December, in January, not when it hits New York? And what do we learn uh, when it hits Mexico? Uh, we shouldn't be sanguine in it. That's Mexico, not the United States. So I think for countries that don't have the resources, don't have the infrastructure, uh, we should try to actually figure out how do we collectively, as a stopgap measure, put those resources in place. But as a long-term measure, we should have floors. And the Pope has called for, this might suggest a basic income for everyone in the world. This might suggest basic health care for everyone in the world. And this is what the Pope is suggesting. Now, he's not an economist, as far as I know, um, but he's suggesting that we are in this together and there are going to be differences, but there should be a basis that no country, that no people fall below, and we should take that on as a global challenge. And we haven't done that. In terms of Europe, has a lot of infrastructure. It's not perfectly aligned for this. It's not perfectly aligned, period. But they could align things. They could use their resources relatively quickly. India, that's a different question. Afghanistan, that's a different question. You mentioned Africa, again, a very different question. Uh, and so, when you think about our global economy, uh, Tom Friedman said years ago, we had a global economic system. We don't have a global social system. We don't have a global system that connect people together. We have a global system that connect finance and goods together. We need to actually extend that in a serious way to people. So that's the challenge. But there are stories coming out suggesting that countries, even in the EU, are moving in opposite directions. Instead of actually saying, how do we work together? It's like, there's scarcity, there's fear. I need to just work with my people, whoever my people are. I need to just work with my institutions. Um, and that's a failed strategy. We know that won't really work. But the impulse of it, when we're dealing with a sense of fear and sometimes artificial scarcity, uh, then the impulse is to go inward. And how we address that impulse depends a lot on leadership, depends a lot on stories, and we're not necessarily getting good leadership and consistent leadership. We're getting some, it's certainly at the state level, but at the federal level, it's a mess. And at the global level, we're picking fights. We're still picking fights. I mean, the idea that you would try to defund the World Health Organization um, in the middle of a pandemic uh, is crazy.
Well, I think you point out many things, one of which is when you say we're all in this together, it's not just all in this in the United States or in Finland or whatever. We're talking about the entire planet, and the dire health conditions anywhere in a globalized world means that everybody's risk rises. And so the whole, what you might call, atomistic model of society and markets and your well-being, to use the old Horatio Alger myth, your well-being is something you can control through your effort, your dedication, your work, your staying in school. All those are noble things to suggest for people for lots of reasons, but they're not sufficient. You can have done everything right and lost your house in 2008 because the government's systemic structure allowed the financial markets to rupture. In this context, you and your family are at risk from things like you pointed out earlier you had nothing to do with creating. Your niece cannot do something if she's following her calling to work in a hospital if she doesn't have a mask. That's dreadful. That's beyond dreadful. But I worry, John, systemically about a globalized system where we are one community, but where what we might say the factors of production, like technology and money, have wings. And people, how would I say, are much more than factors of production. And you can sense that because the resistance to the free, rapid migration of large numbers of people is very high. But when finance and technology have wings, our national leaders and our state and local leaders are put at a disadvantage. In a sense, the model of the nation state where we take care of our body politic is a slightly false consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
because those other factors can move at the speed of light and, what you might call, create a race to the bottom in health, wages, or environmental conditions, which puts, in this case with the pandemic, puts us all at risk. How do we reestablish governance and caring for people as a system in the context of this technology, which, how do I say, makes it, diminishes the power and influence of your government representatives?
Well, I think a number of things. So I think governments clearly don't alone, whether at the state level or the city level or the national level, simply don't have the capacity to govern at the international level. So when we think about climate change, when we think about technology, when we think about, in this case, the pandemic, they don't know boundaries. And trying to assert boundaries simply won't work. It doesn't mean that we actually have one world government, which some people worry about, but it does mean that we have the appropriate mechanisms with the appropriate accountability to actually deal with global problems, including migration. It doesn't mean that we don't still have uh, local differences, local expression, and even local control or influence on certain things, but we shouldn't exaggerate it. Uh, you know, every locality is exposed to this pandemic. And there's we're both from Detroit. There were demonstrations in Lansing, which is the capital of Michigan, and other parts of the country where people were literally showing up with guns, protesting a shelter in place, saying the government can't tell us what to do. We're free. Get the government off our back. We make our own decisions. And it's actually a very flawed notion of our relationship to each other. And uh, a very quick example is that it's an exaggerated and contorted notion of freedom. Uh, and much of our thinking of freedom actually we trace back to Mills, including his book on liberty. And he talks about what he calls self-regarding acts. They're things that I do that don't involve other people, and I should have the maximum liberty in that context, maximum freedom. But when things I do impact other people, then I don't have the maximum freedom. We're in relationship. And so, obviously, this pandemic is a powerful example of what I do not only puts my life at risk, but it also put other people's lives at risk. And the United States, in particular, has had a hard time wrestling with the relationship between freedom and equality. And Lincoln tried to correct that in his famous Gettysburg Address. And that address, which is considered one of the most powerful, important speeches, political speeches in American history, and given in November of 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, he starts off by saying 7 years ago. That was part of the controversy. What was 7 years ago? Well, scores 20 years, so it's 87 years ago. Uh, the United States had done something that he wanted to bring attention to. The thing he was bringing attention to was not the Constitution, it was the Declaration of Independence. He was very deliberate. He wrote many drafts of that speech. And he was talking about that the Declaration of Independence had the aspiration of equality, and the Constitution did not. The Constitution was organized around a distorted notion of freedom, liberty, and property. And Lincoln was critical of that. And at the end of the Gettysburg Address, he called for a new birth of freedom uh, that would be inclusive and would have the proper relationship with equality, uh, and would give the country a new birth where people mattered and would be inclusive. And out of that partially came the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But we never had that new birth, in part because Lincoln was assassinated. So we went back to uh, much of the way we were before the Civil War, and had peonage, and we had sharecropping, and we had Jim Crow, and basically trying to hold on to the country just being for some and not others. And in that context, the distorted notion of liberty. Uh, Again, the pandemic gives us a chance to have a new birth of freedom, to say both freedom and equality are important. And liberals tend to organize more around equality, and conservatives tend to organize more around a concept of liberty. And what Lincoln was saying, a healthy country has to have both. Uh, and it seems to me the pandemic is giving us another chance to have a new birth of freedom.
Well, I've always said, kind of scratching my head, that the notion of liberty, when 90% of the population is indentured, isn't providing what I call the breadth of liberty that they should be championing. And so I think there's almost a false consciousness about unbridled liberty. I was very facetious during the aftermath of the financial crisis, and I said, when we're talking about freedom and liberty, it's not about a bank CEO being able to swing around a $2 trillion balance sheet and do whatever they want. It has to do with, which you might call, not only the freedom to do, but the freedom from toxic intrusion resulting from the action of others. And it's that balance that I think the ideologues about freedom of economic activity don't properly address.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, Roosevelt, when he talked about his four freedoms, it's freedom from fear, freedom from hunger, um, and we do distort it. And freedom is important, but when we put corporations and people on the same footing, people suffer, uh, and we knew that from the very beginning of the country. And corporations, as you know, initially were just an extension of government. And when that relationship was broken in the 1830s, the court was very clear at the time that corporations wouldn't be allowed to influence political decisions. Well, how far have we come from that? And so it's not that corporations are bad. It's not even that having capital is bad. It's that but they should be in service of people, not the other way around. And so we made some mistakes in big subprime crisis in 2010. We rushed to bail out the big banks. Um, we rushed to save General Motors, which I'm glad was saved, but we didn't pay the same attention to people. We didn't pay the same attention to communities. We didn't pay the same attention to homeowners. And in fact, when it was called, and President Obama did call for it, but he called for it too late. He called for it after he had given away money to banks. And then he said it would be nice if you had loan remodification so that people could save their homes. And many of the banks said no. We have our money and we're going to do what we want to do. That was a mistake. And so when we look at corporations, when we look at tech, when we look at big business, it's not that they're bad, but they should be made to be, not just asked to be. They should be made to be in service of people, and not in service of some people, in service of all people, both in terms of how people are employed. People are getting fired now at their job because they're asked to do risky things, and if they protest that there's no face mask, they get fired. That's obscene. Uh, uh, but also in terms of products. So part of it is a rethinking of our relationship with the economy. And again, I think there's no group that has a more important role than INET.
I'm always reminded by years ago I read Tom Hartman's book, Unequal Protection, how corporations became people. And all of the fights in and around the Supreme Court with railroad attorneys, and it was quite a tale. And I would encourage people who are thinking about the proper social design of society and the governing apparatus to take a long look at that work, because I think what you described as the asymmetric role between corporations and people, when after corporations were granted personhood and then unleashed, where their money in the political process is equated with freedom. I think this is, how would I say, one of the root causes of the unresponsiveness of politics and our government to the interests of a broad base of people. And that may be something that has to change. Let me ask you, John, you're very involved in thinking and in strategy, but a change here in the realm of activism, in the way in which what you might call you restore the power of one person, one vote in relation to $1, one vote. What kind of things do you envision or do you sense are necessary to bring this reform to life?
I think there are many, and I think part of it is, the genius of democracy when it works is that we have at least an aspiration for a liberal democracy, which is important to think about because it's not just a democracy. Democracy is majority rule. Um, the people make laws that they obey. But a liberal democracy also says that there are rights of people who are not the majority. And so we want to protect people, even if they can't win at the ballot box, they still, from use the words that we would use, they still belong. Their human dignity is still to be respected and to be intact. Uh, that's actually, and a lot of people will say, well, yeah, but we never got there. It's true. We've never gotten there. But as President Obama used to like to say, we're in the process of trying to build a more perfect union. We have a long way to go, and it's not a straight line. Um, and there are problems at every level. So, for example, the Electoral College, the fact that actually the minority of people can actually elect the president over and over again. And that minority tends to be people who live in not in urban centers. And this is not to cast a deeper division between urban and rural, but the fact that we don't see ourselves as one people, as a nation, or or one planet is a problem. And so I think it's not just seeing that, it's like actually building that into structures. So I would start by backing out things like um, campaign financing, uh, rethink things like the Electoral College, and at the same time saying, okay, one of the fears is that if we don't have the Electoral College, uh, rural and small states will not have any say. That can be addressed. There are all different ways of having federated systems, both at a state level, national level, and international level. You can protect not just small states, you can protect small populations at the same time. Um, and we should have, in a sense, shared responsibility, not just individual responsibility, but also shared responsibility, shared pain, and shared prosperity. And coming out of the New Deal, that was essentially the deal that was being struck. And so when we had growth in the economy, it actually grew faster among workers than it did among capitalists. It grew faster among laborers than it did among corporations. Um, and it's what Paul Krugman calls the Great Compression. The country was becoming actually more equal. And at the same time, we were very productive. The economy was growing at a very healthy clip. Uh, and the country was becoming more inclusive. So it doesn't. So we've actually seen this happen. We've seen it happen in Sweden. We've seen it happen in Europe. We know it's not enough because part of that growth in the 50s and 60s didn't pay attention to the environment and still left out women, still left out um, people of color. Uh, but it was moving in the right direction. Right now, I'm concerned that we're moving in the wrong direction. That we're making, again, from the highest corners of our society, we're calling for exclusion, we're calling for polarization, we're calling for xenophobia, we're attacking people, we're actually fueling racism, sexism, uh, and the only thing we seem to be able to embrace at that level. Unfortunately, that's not the only level. There are other, but it's a small we that's very exclusive and very scared, and money. Uh, so hopefully, it's too soon to say, but hopefully that doesn't reflect the majority of Americans. I think a majority of Americans and majority of people around the world are ready for a new vision and ready for institutions and structures and cultures that reflect that, where no group, no nation really dominates. We worry a lot in this country about the loss of U.S. dominance. I mean, the New York Times over the last year, just go back and look at questions where China's raised. Consistently, they talk about China threatening U.S. dominance. The question, from my perspective, is not should China dominate. The question is how do we create a society where no one dominates, no nation dominates, no race dominates, no people dominates. It seems to me that's the goal we're trying to reach.
When I listen to you, I'm actually reminded that when Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, at a time when you and I were planning and about to execute a conference on race and inequality in Detroit, many of my high school friends who had MD, JD, MBA, CPA, were in Detroit on election night and told me they were going to all vote for Donald Trump because, to paraphrase it, he went around the state of Michigan and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the system is rigged." Now, we may say that the prescriptions that were offered in the subsequent 4 years have not addressed the diagnosis that he shared. But he beat 15 Republicans and obviously Hillary Clinton in the final election and gave voice to some of that despair and dysfunction and acknowledgement that we were off course. What concerns me now is the despondency, the resignation that could take place in light of what's been revealed if we don't see very substantive reform. Years ago, somebody said to me that those documents that you referred to earlier, Bill of Rights, Constitution, Declaration of Independence, became the software of America. And when things were out of line with those principles, which were a defining architecture of our belief system, it set in motion corrective action. Not always successful, but it was embodied in people and in their spirits. And my friend said to me that he feared that someone who cited those documents in this era would be considered a romantic fool, and they were about to lose their traction. So I guess the question I'm asking you, John, it can be paraphrased, is people say it's darkest before dawn. And that's probably true. But from where we are now, are we at the darkest point? Or is it going to get darker still before that light at the end of the tunnel emerges?
Well, a couple of things, Rob. I would say, first of all, um, the challenge in this country in particular has always been who is included in the we the people. Who are we the people? And from the inception, the concept and the practice was that we is very small, starting off with fairly well-heeled, property-owning white men. Uh, but there was a projection in terms of we can expand that we, and we should expand that we. We have to expand that we. So there are a lot of efforts to expand the we. But oftentimes, when the we was expanded, it was expanded with the understanding that some groups clearly were not to be included. So when Andrew Jackson actually expanded the franchise for white men, he actually was very clear in terms of disenfranchising blacks. So he was saying, you can be part of the we, but they cannot. And that's been the move we made over and over again. We talk about including some people, but at the expense of others. Uh, and there's always a fear that if we include those quote unquote others, somehow those who are already in will lose out. And to some extent, that fear is what animated, I think, a lot of the Trump supporters, a lot of the people you're talking about. There's good research, empirical research showing that for many white Americans, when they hear that the country will no longer be majority white, or they just have the experience of going out and seeing people of color, seeing gay people, seeing people who they don't consider normal, uh, both out and even more significantly in control in the presidency in the White House, it's like their whole world is being shaken up. In some ways, the Southern strategy coming out of the civil rights movement, which the Republicans embraced and executed, was how do you actually fan the anxiety of fearful whites and turn that into a political movement? And that political movement became the Republican Party. The Republican Party is white people's party. It doesn't mean that there are people who are not white in the party, but it's organized around the ideology of white dominance uh, and white fear. And it's tricky because we all suffer. Black people, Latinos, Native Americans, Asians, people with disabilities, straight people, white people, we all suffer. So can we imagine a society where my doing well doesn't mean you have to do poorly? Can we imagine a society where we can have an inclusive society where no one dominates? So the fear that a lot of whites have, you think about Proud Boys in Charlotte, uh, um, they're marching saying in Charlottesville, we will not be replaced by Jews. So in their mind, even though it's totally, from my perspective, very distorted, they're afraid the Jews are going to displace them. It's not simply that Jews are going to come into society as equals, it's that they're going to displace white people. Uh, I don't know if we can reach a lot of the Trump people, but it seems to me we have to be clear we are trying to create a society where everyone belongs. If you call that romantic, I would say so be it. What I will say in terms of are we at the darkest moment, I'm not sure. Because I think how we answer this question, will we create a society, a country, a world where all people belong, or will we create a society where it's every man, woman, race, religion for themselves, is a big question. If the if the answer is the latter, then belonging may seem like romantic. But I would say if the answer is the latter, life itself may seem romantic because it's not clear to me that we as a species will survive if we continue to fight each other. I mean, think about it. We had two world wars in a relatively short period of time, 100 million people killed uh, based on fights about resources and nationalism, with the center of it, the epicenter of it, being in Europe. Uh, and out of that came the EU, out of it came the UN, out of it came global systems that basically says the way we structured nation states and the way we define national interests and identity is problematic. And we're flirting with going back to that today. But today, we have nuclear weapons, which we did not have in 1940. Today, we have a climate catastrophe staring at us, which we did not have in the 1950s. So I think the challenges demands a different set of responses. And it's not clear to me whether we will meet those challenges or not. If we don't meet those challenges, to me, there is no light for us, maybe for the planet. The birds are liking this lockdown. The ocean is liking this lockdown. But the humans, if we don't meet this challenge, I think there may not be a light at all.
It's an interesting thing, John, because when you described climate, nuclear war, and we've talked about the pandemic, these are things that can, what you might call, upend and destroy your individualism. And you began in this interview talking about we're all in this together. But the, what you might call counterpart to that is that we all have a responsibility to others, and our collective responsibility gives us even more reason to be politically engaged, because you're not just protecting yourself. Your action is contributing to the protection of us all at a time when that's been sorely lacking.
Well, I think that's right. And there are changes happening. The world is changing very fast. We don't know how it's going to play out, but it is changing. Um, uh, we talked about this before. For example, a lot of what's happening now around this sort of right wing nationalism is organized around a hardcore group of white Americans. Uh, and it's not their whiteness that's the problem per se, it's the ideology of white dominance. But also, we have at the same time, we have uh, a large cohort of whites who are very egalitarian. We have uh, the explosion of mixed families and mixed race, mixed ethnicities in the country, but particularly here in California and Hawaii. And the projection is by the end of this century, it will be the dominant group, not dominant in terms of control, but it would be the plurality of the country. Uh, and at the same time, we have people who are talking about white purity and anti-miscegenation. Uh, and so, um, again, there's more than one thing happening. There's more than one story to be told. There's more than one possibility. And how we lean into these possibilities matter a lot. But they don't. But it's not just a narrative. So, for example, the fact that we have a broken healthcare system, uh, the fact that a lot of people don't have insurance, the fact that it's like for many insurance companies, profit is more important than people. Uh, the fact that we have some people saying, okay, let people die. We need to get the economy back on its feet. The fact that we don't have mass. We're the most powerful country in the world. We have something like 11 aircraft carriers, and we can't build face masks. How hard is it to build a face mask? We've been dealing with this, should have been dealing with this for 4 or 5 months. Um, the fact that we've disbanded uh, the agency that deals with pandemics when our healthcare scientists were saying we're going to be facing a pandemic. Um, so, in a sense, people say there's a discussion in the academy as to whether or not you can have a we without a them, whether or not you can have belonging without othering. And I don't think we know ultimately. We have some indication that we can go much further in terms of having a larger inclusive we than we have. I would suggest we can have a we that includes everyone. But what the pushback sometimes is that, well, people need an enemy. I'm not I'm not sure that's true. But they said if we had a common enemy, then we would have solidarity. We have that common enemy. It's called Corona 19. In a sense, this is an incredible tragedy that's affecting the world, but it's also an incredible opportunity. We have an opportunity to sort of experience, live, and operationalize our shared humanity. Uh, COVID doesn't care if I'm black or white. COVID doesn't care if I'm tall or short. Now, it doesn't affect all people the same. We know that. If you have a pre-existing condition, if you live in certain communities, if you don't have access. So we shouldn't confuse that to saying it's the great equalizer, but it does expose all of us to risks unevenly. Uh, and it calls upon us to act together to change that. And if that's romantic, we should all be romantic.
I want to share with you an experience that came into my mind as I was listening to you. Last year, basically because a couple years before I had given a speech and talked about my father being in the Navy. The United States Navy asked me to come be one of their visitors. And I spent about 3 days on the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier. My father had been stationed alternatively in Hong Kong and in Coronado off of San Diego. I went on this ship. First of all, you fly into this ship, this jet, the military jet that flies you in, you're all strapped in, and it catches on a tail hook, and the physical force is overpowering. They show you planes taking off, these fighter aircraft, and in 2.5 seconds from a standing start, these planes are up in the sky. And obviously, when I went home, I did that too. But in those 2 days, as I reflected on my father's experience in the Navy and reflected upon, and his time in the Navy was during the Korean War and a little bit after, I reflected on my own childhood, the anti-war movement in Vietnam and cynicism about American military engagement. But John, I went into this ship, 4,200 people, and this daunting technology, which has so much capacity to both do harm or to be used as a deterrent to preserve balance and goodness. And of these 4,200 people, I saw many young people, I saw many women, I saw many people of color being treated as though they were part of we, being trained. I sat one night up in the electronic kind of intelligence tower with the captain of the ship and 3 black women under the age of 30 were managing the surveillance vis-a-vis potential incoming attacks. There was nothing going on that night, but they're monitoring all over the world, monitoring communications, monitoring, and their technical sophistication and their training was extraordinary. And so here I was, this kind of anti-war sympathist who often and still does think that the budget of the military-industrial complex is far, far too large in relation to the other needs of society. But I also met the captain and his officers and the young people, and I saw how they were treated, and I saw how they were trained, and I saw them building a confidence and a character. And I felt like perhaps devoted to another mission. Government service, using what you might call the communal psychology that the leaders on this aircraft carrier used, needs to be spread to bring many, many more young people and minorities and disadvantaged to that place. When I flew home, the first meeting I had was with a friend of mine, a gentleman who's both Latin and black, and he works on the trading floor at Bank of America. And I described my amazement, and he said, "Rob, in managing this trading floor, I hire anyone I can get that has served in the Navy in the kind of positions that you describe, because they're so well focused, so well trained, so devoted to their work, and so respectful and contributing to other people around them." These people were taught that we're all in this together. And these were people on the outside that hadn't always been treated that way. So I guess I'm just painting this portrait for you, John, because I think the models are there. And we may not want to use it in the context of expenditure on military power or aggression, where defense often becomes offense. But nonetheless, this was a model. They had 9 different chaplains. I met with all of them, and we talked about how these people interacted, how they stayed in contact with their families and so forth. And it was one of the most enriching experiences of a vision of community that I've ever had a window into.
Well, when people talk about where do we see this happening, the military is one place. It's not the only place, but it's one place. Sports sometimes is cited as a place where people come together who are from different walks of life and oftentimes develop lifelong friendships. Um, can it be replicated? You have the kind of control over people in the military that you don't have in civic life. But companies, people go to work. In some ways, that's very similar. You go to work, and potentially you're working with people who don't look like you, who don't eat the same as you. We could do much better. Um, the capacity and need for people to belong is powerful, but also the fear and fracturing that people are willing to do is also powerful. All that means to me is that what we do matters. It's not given. We can do better. I mentioned the EU. Depending on how you count it, uh, 500 million people came together in a grand experiment after World War II. Um, Before World War II, most people in Germany were not organized around being European. Now, at least half the people in Germany consider themselves European, not just German, but European. The same in France. So, our ability to actually connect with each other is quite profound. You think about Harari in his book *Sapien*. He talks about this. There are 1.3 or 4 billion people who call themselves Christians from all over the world, all walks of life, and they have some kind of shared identity. Um, and Naomi Klein, who's a friend of both of ours, uh, wrote a book called Shock Doctrine. And what she said is that basically, in a crisis, the right, in this case, Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys, they they took the crisis and put things in place that was unimaginable before. Most of them bad, but they took the energy of the crisis. They took the opening of the crisis to do things that was not conceivable before. That's what's facing us right now. We have a crisis, and what's not conceivable doesn't have to be bad. It can be good. Um, now, do we need to rethink universal health care? Do we need to think guaranteed wage? Do we need to think transportation? Do we need to think our relationship with each other? Do we need to think climate change? Um, and if so, how do we do that? And to your point, Rob, it's like, yes, there are proto examples everywhere. Um, and in this crisis, the police, the first responders, the medical people, but even our military, right, can be seen as capable of doing great things in a positive way, good things for not just our society, but all societies. Um, but it takes leadership, it takes work, it takes an imagination. We have to be able to, one of the great things in evolutionary biologists talk about this a lot. One of the great things about Homo sapiens, which wasn't necessarily clear in other uh, human expressions, is the ability to imagine. That may sound silly. It's like, well, what do you mean? A child can imagine. It's what the what they suggest is that the ability to imagine is a relatively new phenomenon, and that most other animals don't have it. How do they know? I'm not sure. But what they're suggesting is that we can think of something that doesn't exist, that we've never seen before, and sometimes we can actually move toward creating it. Cell phones, uh, and of course, when we, you know, uh, most people don't realize the reason they call cars engines having horsepower is that they're relating it back to the horse. Of course, most people don't relate to the horse now, so it's like it's just a term. And how many horsepower does this car have? This 300 horsepower. Uh, a computer is not a fancy typewriter; it is something else. So we have new forms of coming together, um, and I would say, just to give you one last example, there's a friend of mine who wrote a book talking about some of the most innovative stuff in terms of clean environment green environment actually comes from the military. And that's kind of inconvenient. It's like, no, I want to hate the military. They're all bad. Well, it's not. They're not all bad, and certainly there are great people that are part of it, and there may be even needs at time. But also, the military itself can change, and they have changed and made themselves a different organization more than once. And uh, the admirals and generals of the military, have written about this themselves. So all these things are capable of being remade and reimagined, but we have to do the work, and we have to make it real and have examples, um, and that is inclusive. So uh, I don't think it's a reason to despair. It's a reason to actually imagine and be involved and be engaged.
Well, John, just as I talked about the discovery uh, through my visiting the aircraft carrier Nimitz of something, how would I say, a constructive prototype or model or inspiration. I always hear that at times of transition, you probably didn't recognize it, but everything that you should have done was hiding in plain sight. And I guess in my own experience, John, you are one of those things that is so imaginative and constructive that I invited you on this podcast today so that you would no longer be hiding, but be visible and in plain sight and instructive and lead. Because there are very few people I've ever encountered who I have as much respect for and faith in as I do you. And I've seen you help and mentor many people, including my wife. And I've seen you guide organizations. I've seen you work in my home city of Detroit and lead people through that very painful bankruptcy. And I'm very grateful to know you and to follow your guidance as we move into the future. And I only hope that in a couple months' time or whatever, we can come back onto this podcast and from a slightly different vantage point, continue to explore and share your guidance with our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and I appreciate it. It's very mutual, and I think one of the roles of many of us now is making the invisible visible, uh, and I think one of the things that's oftentimes invisible. We talk about sometimes being colorblind. We're not colorblind. The unconscious is very color conscious. But we oftentimes are structurally blind. We don't see structures. They seem natural. And sometimes it's actually more complicated. So think about subprime crisis, and most people had not heard of the secondary market before that crisis, and most people today still don't know what it means. So there are some technical aspects of our world and our economy, and I appreciate that you, INET in general, but you in particular, are just a visionary and constantly move to make the invisible visible and to make the world a better place. And not just doing it from as an economist, but doing it just as a wonderful human being with a wonderful spirit. Uh, and I feel fortunate to count you as a close friend and to have the pleasure of knowing you and your family.
Well, thank you, John. You're a tremendously valuable member of our board and member of an inner circle that gives me guidance in embracing this challenge. There's a whole lot, as you said, that's hiding in plain sight, but we have to invoke the imagination. And your example inspires the imagination and inspires me to reach further, deeper into places I've never considered over and over again. So thank you for today, and thank you for always, and I look forward to the future and exploring with you again. This has
Thank
been a
you
wonderful session. Thank you.
for your amazing grace.
There you go. And check out more from the Institute for New Economic Thinking at ineteconomics.org.